All right, good evening and welcome to the Cincinnati Public Schools Audit Committee meeting for Wednesday, June 26th. It's just about 4:30, so we'll go ahead and get started. I don't have any opening remarks, so we'll go ahead and jump into the audit team in their audit update.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's wonderful to see everyone and hope your summers are off to a great start so far. It's been a hot one this year. So glad to see everyone here. So in your packets, you'll find a copy of our presentation as well as a copy of the continuous auditing report. So those are the documents we'll be working through for our next step. So jumping right into our presentation, Rob, if you don't mind progressing to the next slide for me. Here we have a overview of the things that we'll cover in our audit update presentation. As an aside, we are setting aside 25 minutes or so for this conversation. So we'll try to keep things rather high level and pause between topic areas for questions. So we'll be covering, as I mentioned, the continuous auditing report for fiscal 24, as well as our fiscal 24 internal audit plan wrap up, which will also cover our audit committee dashboard. And then finally, we'll discuss our fiscal 25 internal audit plan and what our next steps are. So to the next slide, jumping right into the continuous auditing report. The fiscal year 2024 continuous auditing report built upon the foundation that we developed in our continuous auditing project this past fiscal year. If you might recall, we audited 2 areas last year and expanded upon that work this year to include 2 additional areas. This year, we audited employee reimbursements and procurement card, which were the 2 from last year as well. And we added overtime and security badges. I'd like to note that each of these areas are a sub-report, and we did that with the intention of being able to have a collective report as well as standalone documents. And we will be covering the security badge report during our executive session as it relates to security matters. And it is in the same sense that we presented the original security report in executive session back in January of 23. So in terms of our methodology, and forgive me, Rob, we'll stay on that last slide. So in terms of our methodology for this project, we determined which tests to include in this year's continuous auditing report based on the significance of the area and the associated control risks. The continuous auditing method empowers us to promptly detect irregularities and intervene to resolve those issues as they arise. In terms of communication, we partnered really closely with management throughout the year. We utilized our Smart Sheets tool to report, track, and communicate the results as we perform the audits. And you'll see we performed our audits on a quarterly basis. So we were able to communicate detailed transaction level results to the individual process owners on a quarterly basis so they could take immediate action if needed to remediate any findings. And then further, from a broader, higher level perspective, we stayed in key step in partnership with the department leaders to not only go through those transaction level tests, but also what does it mean strategically and the higher level recommendations so they can start working on some of those potential improvements right along as we continue testing. So moving on to the next area, I'll hand it over to Isaac to cover our employee reimbursement report.
Thank you. So for employee reimbursements, we kind of followed suit with our fiscal year 23 work as we continue to see progress in each of those controls we tested and areas we looked at. For this testing, we included both sample testing as well as a population analysis. So for the objectives for sample testing, we wanted to ensure that the reimbursement is posted to the proper PO, and the PO is dated before the expense, as well as ensuring that the expense or the reimbursement complies with district and Ohio laws and guidelines, that the expenses are allowable and that they all include proper documentation. For the population analysis, we wanted to ensure that controls exist to prevent duplicate reimbursements. So for the population, The chart or the graph on the left includes the total number of reimbursements that were made throughout the fiscal year. And then the graph on the right includes the total dollar amount of reimbursements made throughout the year. And those are both broken out by quarters. Next slide, please. So for this slide, we wanted to kind of give a high level key takeaway and recommendations, as well as give management a moment to respond to the results. So within the actual sub-report itself, there are a lot more details behind the testing that we performed, as well as the results. And more specifically, the appendix on the last page sums up everything pretty nicely. So for key takeaways, internal audit recognized that new processes and safeguards have been implemented by the accounts payable team. A lot of these new processes and safeguards have been recognized in the status of past recommendation updates that we received. So it's good to see that correlation there. There are continued efforts, I believe we hear this at board meetings as well, to reduce the number of then and now expenses. And we noticed that in our testing as well. And there were 2 recommendations that resulted in the testing for employee reimbursements. Similar to the P card process that Emma's going to be covering here soon. They have a robust process and tools that they utilize to review P card transactions to ensure they're allowable. And so accounts payable can utilize or enhance that the checklist and guidelines that they use to ensure that they kind of follow the same guidelines and regulations as well. The second recommendation that we issue is to revisit automating the duplicate reimbursement control, as we still found a few duplicate reimbursements in our testing. So revisiting that and see how that control gap can be closed. Now I will give Treasurer Wagner a moment to respond. I included a summarized version of what is in the report, but I'll give her a moment as well.
Good afternoon, everyone. So thank you to the internal audit team for doing this work, because we use their work to drive our process improvement efforts. We have 9 teams that are working on process improvement on the second floor. And I just made a note, just very recently when I was covering for the assistant treasurer while he was on vacation, I stumbled across a duplicate. So somebody, the requisition that came across said reimbursement for a PO, but it was to an employee. I'm sorry, reimbursement for a PNC card, which is our procurement card, but it was to the employee, not to the PNC vendor. And it was a receipt that she had already been submitted on her PNC card. So the district paid for that already. And the principal mistakenly included it on her employee reimbursement. So there is a lot of work that needs to be done here. And we'll tackle that with it when everybody gets back from vacation. I'll create a new team and we'll work on defining what the process is, because what we discovered in every one of our issues is that nobody really understood the process from beginning to end, especially when it crosses over departments. And then we'll do what we're doing with some of the other teams and start monthly reporting internally to stay on top of the data and improvement efforts. Just part of the onion of the layers of onion that we keep tackling.
Do you have a question on it?
Mm-hmm.
So can you explain why there is a reimbursement directly to the colleague as opposed to the PNC card? Like, when does that occur?
Mostly it's mileage.
Okay.
So when people are traveling to Columbus, sometimes they'll forget to put a purchase order. So they put a requisition in, and I'll do that each year and say, you know, I'm probably going to travel 500 miles or whatever. And then so that PO is in place. So whenever I submit a reimbursement, which I almost never do, But when they do that, then the PO is already in place, but it's because we don't have an official vendor number. The vendor number is the employee number, but there's no invoice number to control that. It's easy for the AP clerks to possibly duplicate numbers, whatever their numbering scheme is. I can't remember off the top of my head, but that's why I want to drive the team, at least initially, to get them started. But it's mostly mileage reimbursement, or if they go on a trip and they don't have a district credit card, then their meals would get reimbursed, and whatever materials that they would have to buy.
Okay, but in the situation that you just talked about, where the colleague claimed it on the PNC card and then claimed it for reimbursement, that wouldn't be mileage then, would it?
No,
Okay.
no, but in that situation, we have one person who does the PNC work, and we have different people who do the mileage reimbursement work. And so what we need to do is marry their processes.
So is there something that prohibits them from requesting reimbursement for things that should only be reimbursed to the PNC card and never reimbursed directly to the colleague?
Yeah, that was part of one of our past recommendations, if I might, and they've done a really good job now for all employee reimbursements that go to AP. The person in charge of the P card review is handed any document that relates to travel and things that would be likely otherwise on a PNC card to confirm that person is not a P card holder, and if they are, that they're not the same charges. And I think what we've been trying to recommend over the years is that ideally we reduce the number of P cards that we have because it's so laborious. And if someone is an infrequent P card user, employee reimbursements are really preferred route because it's less management and it keeps them off that just total that grows and grows with our P cards as well. And so they have a lot of similarities, but there is a lot of correlation between the two, if that kind of helps.
Thank you.
I don't want to attempt at oversimplifying something that's obviously very complex and laborious, but just speaking from my personal experience, so I have a company card, but I also have times where I don't use the company card, but it all runs through the same application. So, and so if I submit a receipt through there at the end of the month, I have to reconcile my card, and then if I had to submit those receipts to anything that was on a personal card. Are we taking advantage of softwares that are out there that can help automate some of that?
So we're in the process of standing up the PNC card module in business in our ERP system. And so I think the next layer of that is to tackle the employee reimbursement. But up till this year, Carol's been using a spreadsheet system to keep track of all the PNC transactions. It was very difficult. So now that the module's up and running, they're about 95% ready to go live with it. I expect that will help. The PNC itself has a reconciliation software. They have to go in and do their receipts and their line items. The biggest issue is the employee reimbursement process is still a paper process for people to fill out. And then we need to automate that better. So we'll get there. To answer your question.
So I'm sorry.
Just a quick thought. Is it possible while you're still in this paper mode, spreadsheet mode, to layer in some sort of analytic that could just compare dollar amounts to look for duplicates to help shorten up the search time? Or maybe already.
That's actually the analysis I perform. Us taking the employee ID and the dollar amount and finding the exact same amounts.
But then maybe that could be a part of the process instead of
Right.
Yeah.
Jim, you stole my question.
And I believe that is a in progress recommendation for them to start performing that.
And Treasurer Wagner, I know that there's a lot of budget cuts that are coming down, and especially in technology, what I heard the other night. Is this one that's going to get cut?
No.
Okay, great.
Losing 3 bodies, but I'm not losing systems.
Okay.
I will turn it over to Emma for procurement card, which should be the next slide.
Right. So as a reminder, your sub reports kind of have all the background information that you may need on procurement card, but our AR team receives the monthly PNC transaction statements for each of the cardholders during the month. Those cardholders should be submitting receipts or any documentation that supports their transaction. And then Carol goes through each one of those line items and verifies that there is a receipt. It is in line with CPS guidance and either state or federal guidance, and then reconciles back to the corresponding PO. If there are issues within her review, she reaches out to the cardholder. And so what I did was a sample test to look at if the purchases are supported by the adequate documentation, and then if the transactions adhere to the purchasing policies that are set within the district. Our audit overview, you can see from the population, we have the total number of PNC transactions, so each individual transaction. It doesn't seem to fluctuate between Q1, Q2, and Q3, but the total dollar amount does. In particular, within Q2, there was a larger amount that was charged. That was one of my samples, and it's one that happens normally and is supported within Q2. So we looked at a total of 25 procurement card samples. It, I think, totaled to a 35% of the dollar amount. So I thought that was a pretty good threshold to look at for the year, especially when we're kind of only getting a snippet of the samples. We only really look at 10 per quarter since this is a continuous audit. If you want to go to the next slide. I do want to note the key takeaways in the recommendations. So the treasurer's office had significant improvement within the purchasing card process. There were no major issues identified during this year's testing, and there are ongoing efforts required for continuous improvement. Those are somewhat beyond the treasurer's control. They have continuous training in place. They have different types of accountability in place as well. They initiated an escalation plan, a little more stringent in February. So I kind of have seen the difference there between the samples I've looked at. And then again, just to note, we looked at the treasurer's office area within the purchasing card. So going forward with continuous auditing, if we choose to look at purchasing cards, we'll look more toward the purchasing department itself. They still have some recommendations that are open. And I think they might be noted within the last page of that report. So I will turn it over to Jen if you wanted to go through any more of your.
So two things, actually several things are happening with the P cards. One being we started a QI team back in July, and then we implemented the new escalation, more stringent escalation routine. So in your handouts, you have one of these QI team reports that went through Finance Committee. It's the PNC compliance one. If you look at the run chart, you can see where we had this dip back here, and that was due to a longer term illness by the person doing this work, and the work got fallen behind. So one, we cross-trained everybody on the team to help cover and catch up. Two, we started monitoring this data, and then the new escalation routines significantly have started improving since we implemented them. So the first time you're out of compliance and you have so many days to fix it, I cut you off. So before we waited another 30 days and then it just started building up. In addition to that, every month we look at our financial dashboard data, our internal financial dashboard data, and Carol reviews with me and the treasurer's team, the naughty employees, and I help make some phone calls. And so we're starting to, we kind of got lax through COVID because nobody was allowed to travel. So nobody went anywhere. And then as we came back, it took everybody a while to build back good behaviors again. And so we're seeing some significant improvements with this. And we're hoping the Business Plus module will simplify Carol's work. So she's not having to do 10 and 12 emails to an employee because they're missing 2 receipts, back and forth. So we'll be able to generate automated reports and notifications from there.
I have a couple questions. The first is, I guess, for the internal audit team. On the samples on here, I'm just trying to understand representing 35% of total dollar amounts. If we tested 25 transactions and there's $2 million of spend, how did that work?
The samples I selected was, I think, around $635,000. So
Okay.
it was 35% of the total spend.
Okay.
One of them was a big, and it's one that happens every year around the Q2 quarter. So we kind of workman's comp payment.
Okay. That makes more sense to me. And then just kind of a high level observation and maybe more of a question for Lauren, or maybe something that any internal auditors on the committee could speak to. You know, I'm a financial statement auditor, so when we have exceptions, no matter if it's 1 or 11, we have to look at it and say, do we need to expand our testing? What do you look at here on these first 2? Because these had specific tests and attributes that we tested. Are we comfortable with the level of exception? Was more testing considered? Can you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, so the attributes that we select, I think, are a little bit different than I would if I was in a more corporate environment. Here we're looking specifically if that person is using their card appropriately. So while Carol is doing her job, and I can see in all of the documents that I've requested that she's been following up, we still mark it as an exception if that person hasn't provided something. Though once that person is followed up with, and if they're not responding, we move them down to a Q2 sample or a Q3 sample, or I have Q4 samples I'm going to have to go in and re-review to see based on the escalation plan if that person has then provided whatever was missing. So it's kind of twofold where the process is in place and it's working appropriately, but the cardholder themselves is either not responding to emails or they've delayed kind of communications with Carol. And so I know going forward, that's something we need to take into consideration with our attributes. How do we kind of differ what we should be testing with purely the treasurer's office versus what is the responsibility of that cardholder? So one of the things that I think we've added was moving those samples into the next quarter to re-review with the team to see if they kind of fall off the list, or if they are staying on the list. And then if they're in the escalation plan, how do we then audit the escalation plan?
The majority of non-compliance are like a missing receipt, but sales tax on a receipt and over tipping. So our rules were at 15% for a tip, but federal rules changed to 20. So we recently upped it, but people were over tipping, and because it would violated our policy. Then and then what we do is after the first escalation, we don't get a receipt. I just deduct it off their paycheck because I'm not going to keep chasing down $25 here and there. So it wakes people up pretty quickly.
Yeah, and if I could add to, I think part of the question that we consider is when to expand. At what point does a failure rate or an exception rate then trigger additional testing? And for us, it is a little different as internal auditors because our goal, if you will, and when we audit is to provide a recommendation that's going to have notable impact. And so we test enough to feel confident in making such recommendation. And so we learn a lot from partnering with management when we say, hey, we saw a handful. I mean, quite frankly, could be as loose as that just for the sake of a conversation sometimes that relate to all the things they just mentioned. And it's like, yeah, I would bet good money if we expanded it to be the same representation, or regardless, the sentiment sticks. So if we saw, a few more exceptions, would it change what action you would take? So we try to do like a return on investment of our time when it comes to testing. How much more time would it take us to test additional samples? How much more would that improve our confidence in the recommendation? Or do we all feel through conversation and knowledge about the process, since we've worked with this so closely, that we can arrive at really pretty confidently arrive at these recommendations? So that's kind of that balance that we utilize as we decide on testing sample size.
So if I could repeat what I think I heard, just to make sure I understand it. So like on employee reimbursements, attribute C, 25 satisfied, 5 exceptions on reimbursed amount is supported by documentation. So what we're saying is that maybe initially it wasn't supported by documentation, but through the follow-up process, it will. So if you were to look at the 5 that didn't satisfy it at the point in time when you tested it, by now, presumably they would have been satisfied.
Yes, hopefully. And
Okay.
if they haven't been satisfied, then that gets re-escalated to either Carol or the treasurer. And they kind of go through that escalation procedure that they have.
Okay.
And there is a list of people who I'm familiar with their names at this point. That if I see their name, I'm usually selecting them at this point because they are always on some sort of list. And based off of what's now been implemented in February, their part is going to be taken away.
Okay. Because I've always looked at this and like we want to make sure that we understand because these are public reports. So I don't want a taxpayer looking at this and saying, well, what do you mean there's missing receipts? It's like the process is in place to rectify that over a period of time, but maybe at the snapshot in time when we looked at it, it hadn't been yet.
We're trying to get 100% compliance on day one. But there's a process to follow because we're not there yet, but we're getting better.
Yeah, and the other thing I might add too is the caveat to all of our samples is it is not a representative sample. So this percentage cannot and should not be extrapolated among the population. The other piece in the way that we've designed the continuous auditing work, like I mentioned when we started, is sharing these detailed exceptions on a spreadsheet with the management team. So we stay on this, we all stay on this until it is eventually and hopefully quickly resolved as well. So we're doing our due diligence in partnership with management to anything that we identify is fully resolved as well.
So have we ever made a recommendation, and would it be a better process to not reimburse unless you have a receipt?
Well, we don't reimburse unless there's a receipt and with attached to the request.
So for those exceptions that were found, some reimbursements might have 20 receipts attached to them because it was a conference or something. And we would note an exception if one of the receipts wasn't itemized, because for receipts to be valid, they need to be itemized with what was purchased. So if out of the 20 receipts, one wasn't itemized, we would mark that as an exception when in reality, it was a very small piece of the reimbursement, but we still wanted to note that it kind of slipped through the crack.
And this is all probably because there's no automation, right?
Yeah.
That it happened. Okay,
Yeah,
thank
it's
you.
very
Just a mass
manual.
quantity of
Yeah.
several hundred.
But
Yeah, I do.
that, oh, I'm sorry.
I was just gonna add, I've done this a few quarters now, and I do want to props to Carol because it does take a lot of time to even go through the 10 that I go through. So I think with what I've heard with the Business Plus add-in that they're going to be doing, that's going to help her tremendously. So that'll be one thing I think in the next, maybe not next year, but the year after that, it'll be something we re-audit and revisit and kind of see what has been updated and what improvements have been made.
But I think to what Dan's question was, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, as an auditor, I would say that not only does the sample that you use and the error rate that you find, whether or not you can extrapolate is one thing, but it does tell you whether or not your controls are adequate. And I would say on the surface that I would question, I'm looking at the employee reimbursement, attribute B at a 63% fail rate or 63% pass rate. I would question, is the control around that an adequate control? I understand that we're chasing them down and all, and a lot of times we may be getting receipts, but is there a way to shore up that control up front so you don't have, so it sounds like Carol's a very busy woman. I don't want her, the less work she has to do after the fact is probably the better.
I think too, just to re-note for continuous auditing, this was something that we kind of put in place to help management that was in line with the status of past recommendations. So not all of our recommendations for employee reimbursements, P card overtime, or even security have been put into place. So we are going to see some differences there because it's not 100% fixed. This was kind of just a project for us and management to collaborate with to get an idea and a point in time, like what is working, what isn't working, what needs to be changed. So while I think we do have some thresholds that are questionable, I think management is working on those, and we are having conversations that if that control isn't working, we look back at the status of past recommendations and it's only 80% done. So what can we do within that 20% that might fix that?
I was saying, I don't know enough about the process. I'm talking in general terms as an internal auditor.
Yeah, I just wanted to reiterate that because it's confusing with our status of past recommendations and continuous auditing. And I think Lauren is going to go into that later on, where we're not going to audit these areas until 100% improvement is there, because I'm going to go into overtime and you're going to see some of that difference that we've been talking about. We're all good on P card. I will go with the overtime area. So with overtime, I want to get out of the way that it was not an area that was ready for us to test controls. This was something that we've been having ongoing conversations with. So what we decided to do was a sample test to get an idea of if the system itself is recalculating the employee time cards based on what's entered into the system, and then a population analysis where we're analyzing trends in overtime that included both dollar amount and hours. And then we identified any FQAs where actual overtime expenses exceed the overtime budget. Based on what's been updated in our status of past recommendations, there's been a lot of change within this space in leadership and with what it might be in the dashboard, who might be approving it. So it's something I think that is on the front end of priorities for this upcoming year. You can see within our audit overview the total population of employees using overtime. So it doesn't really fluctuate between Q1, Q2, and Q3. Same with the dollar amount. I think there's a little fluctuation between each quarter, but for the most part, overtime has stayed pretty consistent between each quarter for this year. If we want to go to the next. The key takeaways and recommendations for this area, we've recalculated the overtime earnings for 18 sampled employees. Within those 18 sampled employees, we kind of did a little bit of a different background for it. We took a few of the highest overtime earners that we know from prior years who are still the highest overtime earners from this coming year, this year. And then we also looked at each day of overtime that was logged. So if you had submitted an overtime amount for over 8 hours during the weekday, you were up for selection. And then if you submitted over 10 hours on a weekend day, you were also selected for overtime use. So we've been having those conversations with management to say, here are kind of the trends that we're seeing. This is all stuff that is in the drafted version of the dashboard that they will be eventually rolling out. I think when you have the numbers in front of you, it's a lot easier to kind of see where your overtime may be potentially exceeding some of the areas that were initially budgeted. Of course, we take into consideration like the emergency overtime amounts that might be needed. And then also, I think the district needs to come up with a solution for how do we consistently use overtime? There are some, when we did our school audits, we've had some discussions on overtime. Some people didn't feel like they could submit it because it wouldn't get approved. And then other schools were a little bit different. If you're working overtime, you're submitting it and you're getting it approved. So who's going to be doing the approval process? And then does it need to have an overall approval at the end is up for discussion, I think, especially with the transitions that are happening. Other than that, no concerning areas. I feel like we had the big overtime discussion a few years ago. So they've definitely taken in consideration some of those recommendations. They're still being implemented. And we're hoping once it's completed, we'll be able to go in and audit, and we'll be 100% audit. And then I don't know, Jen, if you wanted to go through it.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but the first time you did that, you indicated that the payroll process was paying overtime properly.
Yes.
Right.
this is gonna happen.
So the problem was in allocating for overtime and the use of overtime. And as we started digging into the data, especially around the top 10 people, most of them are custodians. We have 30 vacancies every other day in custodians. So there was a lot of people that were covering for absences. So they might have overspent their overtime line, but they are underspending their salary line. And so we kind of netting those together. But what we did was created and we also found out that every department had a different process for approving overtime and tracking it. And so we created a web form to request overtime. It took a long time to make sure we were addressing on the needs of all the different departments. So facility needs were different than food service needs, that were different than the treasurer's needs and schools. And so we've created this web form to get pre-approval. It's within our ERP system. And now we're actually tracking the reasons for the use so that we can start looking for areas for improvement. But I'm hopeful. We're at the very beginning of this stage, and since we're ending a school year, it's got to die down a little bit, and then it'll start back up in the fall. And we'll see a lot of overtime from school clerks because they're trying to get registration papers in. Because our families sometimes forget that kindergarten starts on the first day of school and that they register on the first day of school. So they have stacks of stuff to do. So it's kind of seasonal. And so we're tracking all the different reasons, whether it's like an emergency when Rothenburg flooded and we had massive overtime effort, right? Or at the beginning of the year. And in my department, we tend to spend more overtime at the end when we're trying to close the books for the year, right? So we're looking for all those kinds of data trends to see where the process is getting helpful. But yeah, it was kind of a disaster at the beginning of the process.
Can you remind me how many total employee populations? What's the total? 6,500. So are you saying that in Q1, 14,000 is
The amount of people who use overtime.
because I'm saying if you have 6,500 employees, you can't have 14,000 hours. Okay. All right. That's what I was thinking. That is kind of high. And then who is eligible for overtime? Like, are teachers eligible for overtime? No. So
Hourly, clerical, custodial, lunchroom people, paraprofessionals. But so salary people are not.
Okay.
Right? So all central office administrators, all field administrators, and everybody that's in the teachers collective bargaining union.
okay. And are you paying over 8 hours for overtime in a day because of a collective bargaining agreement?
It depends on the
Okay.
bargaining.
Okay. All right.
There are several places that from an average day, 7 hours, some 7.5, and then so it really all depends on what position you have and where you're considered in the
Like in the clerical union agreement, they have a daily max and a weekly max, so you have to look at both of those in order to.
Great. Thank you.
The answer is you're not. So just looking at this 14,000 hour, it's pretty consistent quarter to quarter. I calculated that to be about 4% of the total hours. Approximately. That sound about right?
I don't look at that way, but there were some, when we first looked, the first time we did this in the top 10, there were some people that were reporting 12 hours of overtime in a day. And I'm like, that's impossible to do that every single day.
Yeah.
Right? And so I'm sure there's a little bit of abuse in the system, but for the most part, it was covering for vacancies. And so you have to clean the buildings.
And when you guys looked and did your audit, did you look, was the scope of it to compare total compensation, the savings in salaries with the overtime and this, how did that look?
Yeah, so one of the things that I looked at was in comparison to what their base salary was, what the percentage of overtime usage was compared to that. Depending on who we're looking at, there were some people who very well were making the same as their base salary. And again, that all goes back to what is the consistent way of overtime approval. If they're submitting it and someone is just approving it based on looking at it and saying all good, we have to pay them. That's in the collective bargaining union, and there's no really, we can't get around that. So having a consistent overtime approval process in place across the board to say, if you worked it, great, but you're at 168 hours, like how is that humanly possible in 2 weeks? Sometimes we need to have people questioning certain things. And that was from the first audit, I think, that we learned that especially.
Let me re-ask my question.
Okay.
Are the savings in base salaries equal to the extra cost of overtime? Did you look at that?
That's
Can
part
you look at
Yeah, that's part of our recommendation is really the root of what we observed in overtime is that it was for more or less not really being monitored in hours pay, but we can hope, as Jen alluded to, that due to, a reasonable assumption is because there was a vacancy, the overtime cost is offset. And I think that's how this hasn't become a bigger issue is because year over year, typically it sorts itself out. But our recommendation, especially as we enter a season of significant budget cuts, is let's be really prudent. So I think that's a really important comparison. And if with the additional web form tracking, we can add a reason overtime due to vacancy coverage or covering another position, now we can start to compartmentalize that as a total and compare that to the vacancy. And then you have an apples to apples comparison. So I'm hopeful with a lot of these changes, once they are put in motion, we can do some better analysis because it kind of was just a old process that worked itself out, thankfully, but we need to do more than that.
I have a question.
Okay, we had a debate on who actually owns the overtime process. Kind of landed in my lap. I lost that battle. But
So knowing that that there are variances in the processes based on the department, does the new web form, is it designed to help with standardization in that process? Okay.
It reminds me, I think you all might remember my first audit was charter school audits. And do you remember how everybody was doing a little piece, but no one was putting it back together? And this is really reminiscent of that. Everybody has their own way of doing things, but we need somebody to own and pull the pieces together and say, hey, is this reasonable?
So my question is a little bit off of piggybacking what you asked, Jim, but also in the time of budget cuts, when we talk about overtime usage being due to vacancies, at some point it should trigger a department HR to say, this overtime is costing us the amount of a salary. We need to have this vacancy filled. And so hopefully the dashboard will trigger that awareness, and then that will become an ownership issue for HR, or that will become for that department to say, like facilities, hey, your overtime number is 60% and ding, 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 we need this position covered, because technically that's not a savings if you're covering it at time and a half and it's at the same salary of a vacant position on some level.
yes, you're absolutely right. And that's why we put this form together so that we can actually capture the data to analyze instead of it being different departments.
Yeah.
But even beyond that, there's also the whole support, the burnout rate of employees who are working 1 billion hours. And I would question anybody in the treasurer's office to do that, because you can't possibly be accurate with your data, right? So there's that. There's also is there an equitable distribution of who's offered overtime?
Right.
And so there's a whole lot of nuances that can come out of this data. It's taken us, on top of everything else that we do, it's taken us a year to get to where we are.
I got you. So I'm pretty sure it's coming, but it's in process. But to that point, at some point, it's not a benefit any longer. It's a liability. So I'm interested in that. And that should come out. I apologize, I was a little late. So that should come out. That upgrade to the system should come out soon. Or the
we just started using it in April 1st, I believe.
Okay.
And so, every quarter or every month, we're gonna start tracking, and now it's on a dashboard, so we can see it as often as we want to. It's
Okay.
updated nightly. We just need enough data to kind of look at the cyclical issues.
Currently, does it exist where there is, I don't want to say a committee because it sounds like we always do committees, but is there the, is there oversight of the dashboard by all entities to be able to look at the data? I don't know who that
Was to unveil it during the executive leadership team, but that has now completely rolled over almost.
Gotcha.
We're getting back to that.
Okay, thank you.
All right, we've got quite a bit on the agenda still, but this is all good conversation. But I don't want to like shorten in too much, but maybe I can shorten some of my stuff on the self-assessment.
You can kind of put some of that to the office too.
All right.
Can we go to the audit dashboard? And while he's pulling that up, as a reminder, all of the documents we present today are in your folders and you can access them on the dashboard other than the executive session piece, which I will pass out at the end and then collect back. If you encounter any issues within Smartsheet going forward, you can just send me an email. My email's on the dashboard. And then if you guys have any thoughts or suggestions, for improvements for the dashboards or things that you might want to see going forward, if you want to send me an email between now and next audit committee, we can kind of put that in a sheet and discuss it to see if it's going to work with how it operates. Right. So the items for review, I think you guys have read through that. The most notable upcoming date is we're not having finance committee in July. So the next finance committee meeting will be August 16th. And then our next audit committee meeting will be on August 28th. And then if you scroll down to the district external audits. So this year was a new process we put out to track external audits throughout the district. We were able to track 11, which proved to be an effective way to collaborate with various management groups we don't interact with on a daily or weekly basis. It was easy for them to click the link in the email that I sent out and update it as they needed to. And then they got a reminder about 2 weeks before audit committee happened, so we could update that information. So going forward, we plan to distribute a form throughout the entire district to kind of start tracking all of the district external audits, just to enhance transparency and accountability. Of the tracked, there have been 6 completed since the April meeting, with 2 still open. Those were longer term audits, and from what has been updated, there have been no large or significant issues and everything was in compliance. And then if we go down, we can see our task tracker is 100%. Took a lot of manpower to get there, but we were able to do it even amongst the changes that have happened this year. So you can see donations, crowdfunding, and everything below that with our planning process, our field work phase, and our completion and reporting is all 100%. And I think it looks good as green. That being said, we are going to be transitioning into our planning, and Lauren will go more into that, but I'll let Isaac kind of go through the bottom half of the dashboard with the status of past recommendations.
I'll be super brief with this part. So this last update from management was the 6th and final update for fiscal year 24. With the end of the school year and all of the changes in leadership, there wasn't quite as much progress made that we had typically seen from the updates. However, after this meeting and before August, we're planning to make updates to who we receive updates from based on new leadership and based on the new org chart. And then for individuals that are new to this process, we're gonna ensure they're set up to provide those updates moving forward. Then for individuals who have historically participated in providing updates, we are going to receive feedback and ensure everything is set up for fiscal year 25 with the updates. So this will continue on into fiscal year 25. There just may be a few different members of management who are responsible for providing the updates. I will turn it back over to Lauren.
So we'll hop back into the slides wrap if you don't mind. And so I'll try to be as quick and succinct here as possible, and then leave a minute at the end for some questions, but I know we are running behind now. So for the graph slide on, let's see, the one with the larger blue slice. So the next one. Yep, thank you. So the good news is with all of our utilization of smart sheets, we now have data, and it's data that we can bring to you and that we can analyze. So this slide and the next are graphical representations of the work performed by the internal audit team this year. We were able to utilize smart sheets to track our time, not only by project, but also by specific task. And this has enabled us twofold, like I said, to present and share this with you, but for us to analyze where our time has been spent and how long it takes us typically to do different types of projects. So as we get into planning for next year, we have a more of a baseline as to what's reasonable and attainable in terms of size and breadth of the plan. So I think this graph provides an interesting summary as it's all tasks that the internal audit team works on throughout the year. We're pleased to see that nearly 70% of our time is spent on the audit plan itself. But it also gave us some perspective on all the other things our team works on besides the plan, as well as other assignments that we receive. So you can see we have the meetings are, of course, our own internal meetings, but also board committee meetings. And then we see board requests as well as audit committee preparation, and of course, professional development as other categories. To break it down a little further, the next slide is a depiction of our percentage of time spent on each project within this year's audit plan itself. So it allows us to see that there is a strong correlation between the time that it takes to produce our larger audits. So we see that we produced a school audit report and then the 3 school audit reports to the principals, as well as these 4 continuous audit reports. And that was 62% of our time this year. So I think it's, for us, it's not surprising in that regard. However, I think it opened our eyes to how much time we spent on recruiting, onboarding, and training our intern. That was a really big lift. So we're recruiting among other big companies, but among big audit firms, but we're looking for one. We want one audit intern. And Ernst & Young's next to us, like, we'll take everyone. So it's really, you know, we're trying to get in the game while we still do all of our audit work. So we're like mini recruiters on the side. But we were fortunate to have someone join us. We recruited all in the fall, had Aaron Allen join us in December, and he was with us until April as an MBA student. But I think personally, and I think our team was a little surprised how much of our resources it took to execute that. So our hope is we're going to learn from what we did this year, make it faster, more efficient, and ask you all to send us your best collegiate candidates you can find. So yeah, we'll continue working on that. But I just thought we thought this was interesting data and things we'll use as we move into next year's planning, which brings us to our next slide. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes.
The school audits, that was a pretty big chunk of time.
Yes.
Is that because it was initial?
Yes. Anything new. That's what we've learned over the years is anything that's a repeated audit, much easier. Anything that's brand new was a lot. And honestly, from a planning perspective, the school audits was huge because Jen's kind of used to us by now. Hey, we're coming in, we're doing our thing. But the schools, it's what are auditors and who are you kind of thing to some degree. So it definitely took a lot this year. Yeah, great observation. Great. So the next slide is thinking through fiscal 25. So now as we look ahead into fiscal 25, where are we? So thus far, we've built out our annual risk assessment to the greatest degree possible. However, we are waiting on a lot of key information that will have significant impacts on that risk assessment and ultimately our plan. We're waiting on our fiscal 25 budget as that is developed and decided on, as well as the organizational chart. So as we get into our district updates later in the agenda, we'll discuss a lot of the shifts in leadership that have happened. I think Jen alluded to the executive leadership team is almost entirely different as of the last few weeks. And an organization chart was just released on Monday, 2 days ago's board meeting. So there's critical information that we need to understand between budget cuts, who's going to be leading each area, how are the processes changing, and what gaps and risks may arise and develop from those changes. And so we plan to gather and analyze this information between now and our next audit committee with the goal of presenting a formal audit plan to you at the August 28th meeting. So where does that leave us? What will we be doing for the next 60 days, you ask? So of course, as I mentioned, we're going to get right into the risk assessment. This is huge. This is big. It could be, might be one of our biggest years of risk assessment because there's so many more components and things in motion. So we want to ensure we're aligning with the fiscal 25 new leadership's goals and strategies, as well as the board's. So we'll also, as Isaac mentioned on the status of past recommendations, we are going to utilize, now we have this whole set of data as to what is now complete or implemented. That will then become our menu, if you will, if it hits certain criteria of what could be continuously audited. So that's giving us a much healthier starting point for scoping continuous audit. Like we mentioned, probably over time was a little premature for us this year, but we didn't know it because we didn't have a full set of data like we do now. And then we'll continue our work around the IA standards compliance and our risk matrix work. And then another really big and somewhat time consuming item is anytime there's a change in management, we need to onboard the new superintendent, her leadership team regarding all of the internal audit work that's in progress and what's to come. So the good thing is these items will help us achieve the goal of delivering the plan, to you at the August meeting. And really a formal internal audit plan doesn't change the day-to-day work that we would have been doing anyways. This is really the next step in what we would expect to be doing this time of year. However, it allows some flexibility to really fine-tune a plan that is well aligned with what we're going to be facing this year. So I think that concludes, that was my, forgive me, talking fast, really fast on that one, just to get through. But if you have questions, please let me know and happy to discuss any aspects.
Okay, thanks, Lauren. If there's no additional questions for her, we'll move on to the next item on the agenda, which is fiscal year 2024 audit committee self-assessment. And we really don't have anything, formal that we really have to do and write down and decide today, since we are running a little tight on time. But each year at the end of the fiscal year, we like to look at what we established as goals. And I know that everybody that's been here long enough remembers that it has been very difficult for us to establish tangible goals and tangible returns on our time and and so I guess the things that I'd like to just kind of throw out there that we can think about, and maybe we can build some time into the August meeting to talk more about this. But as a starting point, do we feel like we're effective as a group? What can we do better? What can we help the district with? And also I would ask the board members, as an advisory committee, as a volunteer committee of community members, what are areas that you see the audit committee being able to help out with and give input, and is that a way that we could look at fiscal 25 as areas for us to grow and develop as a group? I think we've come a long way as a group. The audit team has come a long way over the years, but there's always, I think I always say this every year, current events, what's going on now is usually where we tend to get a little bit involved, and we can add some value there. So certainly want to take a little bit of time, open up to the group if you have observations, comments, and we'll continue to build this out in the next 60 days and have something kind of more formalized in August.
I'll say, the goal that we had as far as the audit committee meeting preparation, I think attending the meetings that aren't just the audit committee and using that information to assist in the preparation, I think should stay. I have attended several of those meetings online. And it has helped with once I get the information or the packet regarding the audit committee. So I have kind of some background information about what has happened. So I think that helps with the efficiency of this meeting because I've heard from the departments what is actually going on. And it's been vetted. And so for me, it has helped tremendously with this meeting.
Hey, Dan, would it help as a goal to maybe think about maybe having a committee member at each one of the finance committee meetings, just rotating, just volunteers show up? I know I've attended them and it is helpful, but I don't know, just a thought.
I'm not opposed. I'd be curious what finance committee members what would that be valuable to have a member of the audit committee there?
I mean, I think it is. I think to the point that was just made, I think understanding some of the things that are coming through finance, and again, we give you the materials afterwards, but seeing the actual discussion helps. I think we've also rolled out some ideas that are on the, on the plate that come up this year that would be worthwhile. So I mean, again, I think we talked a little bit at the last finance meeting about the treasurer's dashboard that they're working on. Some of these other things that are things that we're working through that'll be informative to understanding what then as an audit committee, what should be kind of the expectations in regards to some of that. Because if they, if you hear about something and then we never hear about it again, maybe as an audit committee, you say, okay, well, did it have a value to what we were implementing or did we do anything with it? The other part is that my hope or my goal, and Lauren and I have talked about this, is to at some point bring a presence to what the audit committee does and what the audit team does to the larger board. And so I do think sometimes that can be helpful to understand where you might see suggestions or thoughts as to how to make that more clear, because that's another part that I think Jim has said a lot about it actually in the past about how do we explain the ROI of what the work the audit team is doing. And so that's another way that may help in that thought process. I don't think that you necessarily have to come in person. You are welcome to come online because I know we tend to have them in the middle of the day and the work day. And so it may not be as feasible for everybody to attend in person, but.
I think that prior to budget, so I'm going to say prior to May and then now. So prior to May, I think the audit committee's work was to help the auditor and our treasurer and the board to kind of be a third eye to see from the community members' perspective, what is your information anyway? This is public information. Now, more so than ever, I think we see, as a board member, I see this work a lot. It is very helpful. And I think it's all hands on deck. Community, people with financial background, people with no financial background. We need all hands to help us in this particular time, but particularly to help us be more efficient and help us to be responsible. And I think now more than ever, we need that. So the more informed that you could be attending a meeting, watching a meeting, either in person or online, watching it after, sending questions to the auditor, to the treasurer, to help us to see sometimes what I may miss as a person who sees it all the time is just particularly helpful. I think the more the community understands school finance and what we deal with innately is super helpful for us selfishly in passing levies, but also in just being more efficient with students and the schools and spending money, because you all now know more intimately about the overtime issues. When we talk about vacancies at the board meeting, now you have some more intimate knowledge about, okay, well, why are they trying to get rid of vacancies? Like, what does that mean? And now you have more context to put it in. So I would always suggest that you all stay tethered to bringing your lens to this meeting and helping the auditor and the treasurer explain it to you in lay terms so that you can go back and again help us be efficient, but then relay that information to the community, to the communities that you represent. Doesn't have to be person. That's a lot of commitment, but I need you to commit to something. So whether it be watching us online and or just commenting, coming in during the meeting, and we will bring you in to say, hey, I like that question, but did you think about this? You have that invitation to be able to do that in budget and in the meetings. I personally think we all need to tie together so that the board needs to hear from audit, not just the 3 finance members, but from the audit committee regularly. So if that's quarterly, I just think that the system needs to connect. And so in my mind, your voices are super important, and whatever perspective you bring, even now understanding the dashboard more, that's going to help us in the community show that we're being responsible. And so if maybe the goal to set a goal to being able to understand the dashboard, being able to manipulate it, and then share that out with your respective communities, and get feedback from them, and then come back and say, so whatever the goals are, I think you are the community connection that we need to be able to branch out and get the community to understand what the district is going through. It's just my 2 cents.
I like that idea of, connecting back to the board. You show up, you see, but there's how many board members, and they're busy doing other things. So they don't get that perspective. But if you think of it, and I know it's much different than a public or a private entity, that would be an expectation that there are members of the board that runs a company would be on an audit committee, and then that audit committee would report back to the entire board. So finding a way to provide valid feedback or valid thoughts that can show we are just, community members, our thoughts and opinions on things. I think that would be a really good thing.
So Dan, I wanted to highlight one other thing that we're going to need the audit committee's help for, and highlighting the fact that we are going through a lot of change already. We also know that there's a pre-planned change that will be occurring at the end of the next fiscal year, which is we will lose Jen because we can't keep convincing her to come back, even though we beg. But I think it's another aspect of the work that we're going to be doing and looking for a treasurer search, that we're going to need folks from the audit committee to be a part of that discussion and a part of that process in some way, whether it's providing thoughts and questions and inquiries, it's highlighting the different things that might be worthwhile, or even, because this is going to be a hard search, suggesting folks to bring to the table as potential folks to consider. Again, because we know that this is going to happen and we want to start that process early and do a good, thorough process of vetting and considering and recruiting folks.
So last time they did a treasurer search, there was at least 2 audit committee members that served on like an initial interview team. Lou Bushley and Tom Conlon. Those are names from the last, and some of you remember them. So that would be really helpful. I need some ideas for some Just Ask Jen topics. So if you think about it, so if you don't know what Just Ask Jen is, we started, Dr. Moffat started pushing me and my goals to be more engaging with the public and helping to inform the public and getting their feedback. And so we created these financial town halls, and Dr. Moffat named them Just Ask Jen, and so we're getting ready to set the schedule for next year. So I'm looking for topics for people that from the outside of the district want to know more about financially, whatever that might be. So if you have any ideas on what you think the public would like to learn about, we'll put it together.
I think Jen has a very full plate. And it seems like she continues to get dumped on and everything in her lap. So it's going to be very hard shoes to fill. But I think from my perspective, thinking about how I evaluate or assess our contribution and our ROI, it's been difficult because there's been a moving target. We've had leadership change. We're trying to put processes in place. So trying to measure year over year, you can't get to a stable year to be able to look year over year. So every time we look back at something, it looks like we haven't improved. So that therein lies my frustration, some of my frustration in HR, we look, or in benefits. When we go back to another audit, it looks like we're still in the same space that we were in. So I would like to see us be able to somehow get to some stability where we could really evaluate what the differences are year over year, because I don't think I have a true handle on it when I look at it, or someone comes in to give us a report, that I think incrementally have we improved, because it seems like some of the same issues still exist. And I think because leadership is changing in some of these positions, again, it takes a while to get up to speed. So I don't know how we address that and deal with that, but I think that's our challenge here on this audit committee, to be able to evaluate what our contributions really are and how we're moving the needle. I don't know if that helps you or not, but
Yeah, I don't disagree with that sentiment at all. It is challenging. Can be a little frustrating to not be able to say like, oh, we did X, Y, Z and it resulted in A, B, C. I do sometimes rely on my gut, and my gut says that this group, we would never want to disband this group. I think we provide value, right? We would never want to disband the internal audit function. So it's just a matter of, in our minds figuring out what exactly is it. But my gut says the good work is done in this room for only the 6 times we meet a year. And so this has been all great feedback. I think what we might do is Lauren's suggestions, maybe in our next planning meeting for the August, I can work through putting some things together, and we'll bring up draft goals for the August meeting. And certainly if there's any other comments between now and then, email, can they email me directly? Okay, just no group emails. Okay. No group discussions. Okay. So yeah, or call me if you want to do that too. We can talk through this. So we've got some time.
Wanted to piggyback on what Brandon was talking about a little bit with Jen's, we can't beg anymore. But I might be interesting when you do the risk assessment in August, maybe it's possible to dovetail that in with something from Jen, maybe with where she could put together, I know you got a lot to do, but you might want to put together at a high level where your struggles are and what would be your dream plan for the treasurer's group. And that maybe that could dovetail into the risk assessment, because even, it would be good to have a new treasurer coming in, knowing a little bit about what your vision would be to have a perfect world for you. Just a suggestion.
Thanks, Jim. If nothing more there, Lauren, I see fiscal year 2025 planning on here again. There's nothing more there?
That's just both of these sheets. So it's reviewing, reflecting on fiscal 24 goals, thinking what do we want to do for fiscal 25. So I think we captured what we did well and then where we want to go.
Okay, great. So we've still got 2 pretty important topics. So I'll let board members and Jen, whoever wants to give us a general district update. And then we do need to have time for our executive session. So we might, hopefully it's not too cumbersome if we go over a little bit here, past 6 o'clock this evening, just because I don't want to skip over these 2 items. So
I'll try to be quick, and then I'll let Jen also talk a little bit about where we are budget status wise. But as you all know, since the last time we met, there's been some substantial change to leadership of the district. And so we are working through, we had the new org chart that's been presented at the last special meeting that we had on Monday. Additionally, there are certain suggestions that are out there right now that are being worked through and being thought about with regards to changes at certain schools, plan for a longer term district rollouts. Additionally, just as we've talked through in finance, and I think it's one of the biggest things we have seen value in the finance, you'll see it in the reports, is some of the QI reports have been really, really helpful in us getting to understand where some of the potential opportunities are for us to learn more about what's going on in some of the school levels, but also to see how dollars are being used. And I'll give one quick example. We just talked about Schedule E funds at this past meeting. And one of the things we recognize is how different some of the Schedule E funds are being used at different schools. But that also may mean that some schools have a ton of organizations, ton of groups and clubs, whereas another school may have athletics. It's a big portion of their Schedule E. And how do we define that? How do we look at that? How do we say, how much dollar it's going to per pupil? These type of things are all things that we can now start to think about and really have a discussion on, because we've been doing these reports and looking at the ROI of the value, the key performance indicator values of how the dollars are being spent. So I think it's been a really helpful thing that we've added to the budget, finance, and growth meetings for those who have gotten a chance to look at and watch. But, again, like we said, when there's a lot of change that happens in the district, there will be a period of time where we are kind of adjusting. And so I think that's where we kind of sit on that end. I don't know, Jen, if you had thoughts with regard to the budget process.
Been a painful one. So as the transition in leadership superintendency switched over, we created what we call a budget task force. So it's kind of like Noah's Ark. It's like 2 people from each union and some administration, but it's been an incredibly collaborative, very transparent, and very almost pleasant to do, even though the topic is difficult. Everybody is sacrificing and they're stepping on each other's toes, but doing it in a nice, kind way. And so we've had some great ideas on how to reduce budget. We're about $6 million away from a balanced budget. So the Monday night, the board approved a temporary appropriation. We now have 90 days to finish the work, or have to quit spending money. So we'll get there. We're going back to look at some of the things that had initially been rejected as budget cut items, and reevaluating some of those, and maybe in a different way. Because if not, we're going to be looking at a reduction in force. And that's going to be incredibly painful on top of the reductions we've just made. So it'll be very difficult. We're in the process of closing out the year. Things are looking good. Tomorrow is Friday is the last day of our fiscal year. It's June 30th on weekend. So we're making progress. It's been tough. It's been a very unique year in terms of budgeting. So maybe sometime next time I'll kind of explain why this budget is such a huge challenge from year to year. But our resources aren't increasing, but the costs are. And so even if we do absolutely nothing different, our salaries go up by about 2% because of step increases that are negotiated into the collective bargaining units. And so we're already in a cost cutting measure, right? Without doing anything new or innovative. And then the ESSER cliff is upon us. And so we've been talking about that for a few years, so we're trying to address those, scaling back those services. Happy to answer any questions.
So that ESSER money that's going to be going away, have we allocated it all? Okay.
Yeah, I'm willing to bet, and I'm put money on the table that Cincinnati Public Schools is probably the best efficient spending on ESSER. We will have no dollars left at the end of the day.
I will tell you, to realize how big of an accomplishment this is, that other even larger districts than we are have really struggled with fulfilling the requirement of meeting to fill those dollars and spend those dollars in a way that's actually what they're intended for. So a large part of the discussion about 6 months ago with many of the larger districts across the country was, well, so can we get away with using it for this? Can we use it for that? And like the discussion we were having was, okay, so we're going to finish all the projects on time. We already know that we had this thing figured out. We already had a plan. And then smaller districts struggled with, we don't have cash to do the work to wait. In some way, in some cases, we talk about this in budget finance, some of these reimbursements take a year or more to receive your reimbursement. So do you have the money on hand to do the work and then wait, right? And so we have been, in a lot of ways, good fiscal stewards of both making a plan to use the funds that we were allocated, but then also making sure that we had the funds on hand to cover the cost as we do so. And I attribute a lot of that hard work to Jen and her team for really being on top of it.
They kept changing the rules, so every year. So it was $328 million over a 4-year period to spend, but they kept changing the rules. So it started off being about cleaning and protection and, social distancing. And now it's changed into, then it was remote learning. Then it was into getting back to face-to-face learning. And now it's about learning loss, recovering from learning loss. And so when you have a multi-year plan and they keep changing the rules, it makes it really hard to do that. But we have a small and mighty grants team. They're doing an incredible job. Yeah.
And they keep moving the deadline. So, it was it June and
June
then
30, and then we have to encumber the funds by September 30 and pay it out by December 30. So,
which is good, but it's also frustrating because you try to get that done. And there is a public dashboard around, if you're interested, the state of Ohio and what districts have spent their money on and what districts have not. And we are doing really, really well. And there's been different phases. So, and in a Just Ask Jen, we talked about this. So you can go back and watch them. They're just an hour, but you can go back and watch them as well.
All right, if there's no more questions there, someone make sure I do this right. Could someone please motion to recess into executive session to discuss security matters?
I'll motion that we move into executive session to discuss security matters.
Can someone second?
Second.
All right, so I think now, all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed?